The undisturbed bed. Sleep state and removal method analysis. We've examined biological clocks and movement patterns, traced staging geography, and staircase selection. And now we need to turn our attention to something that sits at the very beginning of the timeline we've been given. A detail so quiet, so easily overlooked, that it almost disappears into the background of the larger narrative. When Detective Patterson entered her bedroom that morning, he noted something significant. The bed looked slept in, not disturbed by struggle, not showing signs of confrontation or resistance, but simply slept in, the natural disarray of a child who had occupied that space during sleep and then departed from it. This observation, documented in the early hours of the investigation, tells us something critical about how she left that room. And more importantly, it tells us something about what didn't happen there. Because beds, like bodies, preserve evidence of what transpired in their immediate vicinity. And this bed whispered that whatever terrible events occurred that night, they didn't begin with struggle in that bedroom. Let's establish what we're examining before we begin to interpret. From a forensic perspective, when someone is taken from a bed against their will, when force is used or struggle occurs, the bedding typically shows evidence of that confrontation. Covers pulled askew in ways that go beyond normal sleep movement. Pillows displaced, sometimes items knocked from bedside tables. The scene reads as disturbed, disrupted, evidence that something beyond peaceful sleep occurred in that space. But that's not what was documented here. The bed showed signs of having been slept in, normal, natural occupation, but not signs of struggle or forcible removal. This creates a profound question about how she left that room. If she left peacefully, if she wasn't fighting or resisting as she departed that space, then what does that tell us about the circumstances of her removal? And perhaps more significantly, what does it tell us about who was doing the removing? Theme 1. The question of consciousness, sleeping, waking, or something between. When we think about a child leaving a bed in the middle of the night, we're really thinking about states of consciousness and what they would reveal through physical evidence. From a physiological perspective, there are several possibilities we need to consider. She might have been fully asleep when removed, unconscious, dead weight, requiring someone to lift and carry her without any participation on her part. She might have been in that twilight state between sleep and waking, aware enough to cooperate minimally, but not alert enough to resist or question. Or she might have been awake, roused from sleep by something or someone, conscious and mobile on her own. Each of these states would create different evidence patterns in the bed and bedroom. And what we're told was documented, a bed that looked slept in, but undisturbed by struggle, helps us narrow down which of these states is most consistent with the physical evidence. Let's think about what it means if she was asleep when removed. From a logical standpoint, lifting a sleeping child from bed, even a small child, requires coming very close to that bed, leaning over, sliding arms underneath to support the body's weight. This is intimate proximity, physical contact that would necessarily disturb covers and bedding to some degree. But there's a difference between the disturbance created by someone carefully lifting a sleeping child, perhaps a parent who has done this many times, who knows how to minimize disruption, and the disturbance created by forcible removal against resistance. The first creates subtle displacement of covers, where the body was, perhaps some gathering of fabric where arms reached underneath. The second creates chaos, covers pulled completely askew, potentially off the bed entirely, pillows scattered, the clear signature of struggle. The documented state of the bed suggests something closer to the first scenario, someone who could access that space and remove her without creating the kind of disturbance that would indicate force or resistance. Now, let's consider the psychological implications if she was awake when she left that bed. From an anthropological perspective, children in the middle of the night typically respond to being awakened in one of a few predictable ways. If awakened by a parent or familiar caregiver for a normal reason, time to get up for a trip, need to use the bathroom, checking because they heard the child call out, they typically comply with minimal fuss, perhaps some grogginess, but no resistance. If awakened by something frightening, a strange noise, an unknown person, they typically freeze initially, then might cry out or try to hide or seek the protection of covers. What we don't typically see is a child leaving bed with someone unknown without creating disturbance, without any evidence of fear or resistance in how the bedding was left. So the undisturbed state of the bed suggests that if she was awake, she left with someone she trusted, someone whose presence in her bedroom didn't trigger fear or defensive response. From a criminological perspective, this is where certain theories begin to strain against the physical evidence. If we're asked to believe that someone unknown entered that bedroom, that they approached a sleeping child or awakened her, that they needed to ensure her compliance and silence as they removed her from that space, the standard narrative suggests a stun weapon might have been used to achieve this. But let's think through what that would actually mean physically. A stun device applied to a child would create an immediate, intense physical response, muscle contractions, pain, potentially vocalization despite the intent to silence. And here's what's critical. If such a device was used in the bedroom, we would expect to see evidence of that struggle in the bedding. The involuntary muscle response to electrical current would create thrashing, disruption, covers pulled in directions consistent with uncontrolled movement. But that's not what was documented. The bed looked slept in, not struggled in. This absence of disturbance doesn't support the stun weapon theory as it applies to the bedroom removal. Let's shift to the philosophical implications of what an undisturbed bed tells us about relationship and trust. From a psychological standpoint, children in their own beds, in their own rooms, in the middle of the night, are at their most vulnerable. They're disoriented from sleep. Their defenses are down. Their reality testing is compromised. In this state, they typically respond with trust to familiar people and fear to unfamiliar ones. The fact that she appears to have left that bed without struggle suggests one of two possibilities. Either she was so deeply asleep that she never regained consciousness during the removal process, or she was awake enough to comply but felt safe enough with whoever was removing her that no resistance seemed necessary. Neither of these scenarios aligns particularly well with the presence of a dangerous stranger in her bedroom. A sleeping child being lifted by a stranger might wake partially and resist. An awake child confronted by a stranger would almost certainly show some sign of fear or resistance in the disturbance of the bedding. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about what children do when they wake in the middle of the night on their own. When it's not someone waking them, but their own body's needs or discomfort rousing them from sleep. Children who have accidents during sleep might wake up partially, aware that something is wrong, uncomfortable enough to seek out a parent or to go to the bathroom. The bed of a child who woke themselves and departed would show disturbance consistent with movement, covers pushed, back as they got out, perhaps some disarray if they were groggy and uncoordinated. The documented state of the bed, slept in but not showing signs of self-initiated departure, suggests that if she left on her own volition, it was in response to someone or something, not just her own internal wake signal. And if she left in response to someone else's presence, we circle back to the question, who could enter that room and prompt her to leave the bed without creating evidence of fear or struggle? From a logical investigative perspective, the undisturbed bed creates a significant constraint on possible scenarios. We're left with a narrow range of possibilities that can account for this evidence. She was lifted while deeply asleep by someone who could approach closely and handle her gently, or she left the bed willingly with someone she trusted, or she woke on her own and departed for her own reasons before anyone else's involvement. Each of these possibilities has different implications for the timeline and for who could have been involved in what followed. But what the undisturbed bed definitively rules out are scenarios involving forcible removal, struggle, resistance, or the use of any device that would create involuntary physical response in that space. The bed preserved the evidence of a peaceful departure, peaceful in the sense of no struggle, even if what followed was anything but peaceful. So, when we step back and consider what that slept-in but undisturbed bed tells us about consciousness and removal method, we're looking at evidence that speaks to the very beginning of the sequence of events that night. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the bed's condition suggests that her departure from that room occurred without resistance, without struggle, without any confrontation that would have left its signature in displaced bedding or disturbed space. This doesn't tell us who removed her or why or what happened after she left that room. But it does tell us something crucial about how she left, and perhaps more importantly, it tells us what didn't happen there. The bedroom was not a scene of struggle. It was not where resistance began. Whatever terrible events unfolded that night, they began somewhere else, in some other space, under circumstances that allowed for her removal from that bed without the kind of disturbance that force or fear would have created. Theme 2, the stun weapon paradox. Why one theory collapses under its own logic. We've established that the bed showed no signs of struggle, and now we need to confront directly what this tells us about one of the most persistent theories in this case, the idea that a stun weapon was used to subdue and control her. This theory emerged early, based partly on marks observed that some interpreted as consistent with such a device. But when we trace this theory through the actual sequence of events, when we follow its logic from the bedroom through to what we know occurred later, something doesn't hold. From a criminological perspective, if a stun weapon was the method of control, we need to ask ourselves, where would it have been used, and what would we expect to see as a result? Let's start with the bedroom scenario that the stun weapon theory requires. If someone unknown entered that room, intending to remove her silently and without alerting the household, And if they believed a stun weapon was their means of ensuring compliance, they would have used it immediately upon reaching the bed, before she could cry out, before she could fully wake and resist. From a physiological perspective, stun devices work by delivering electrical current that causes involuntary muscle contraction and intense pain. The body's response is immediate and beyond conscious control. Muscles seize, the person typically falls or collapses. There's often vocalization despite the person's desire to remain quiet, because pain responses can override conscious control of vocalization. Now, if this occurred in her bedroom, in her bed, what would we expect to see in the bedding? We would expect chaos, covers pulled and twisted by involuntary muscle contractions, evidence of the body's uncontrolled response to electrical current. But that's not what was documented. The bed looked slept in, not struggled in. This absence of disturbance in the bedroom creates our first problem with the stun weapon theory. But let's follow the theory further. If we accept, for the sake of argument, that somehow a stun device could be used in the bedroom without creating the bedding disturbance we would expect, perhaps she was lifted while deeply asleep and the device wasn't used until they were away from the bed. Then we need to ask, what would happen next? From a logical perspective, stun devices don't create sustained compliance. They create immediate incapacitation through pain and muscle disruption. But the effect is temporary. Once the current stops, the person regains control of their muscles relatively quickly, though they may be disoriented and in pain. So if the goal was to remove her from the bedroom, move her through the house to the basement, and maintain control of her during whatever occurred there, a single application of a stun device wouldn't be sufficient. Multiple applications would be needed every time she began to resist or attempt to cry out. And here's where the theory truly begins to collapse under its own weight. From a criminological perspective, consider what we know about what occurred later. The evidence suggests there was significant struggle or confrontation at some point, given the nature of what occurred. If someone had a tool that could immediately incapacitate through pain and involuntary muscle contraction, why wouldn't they use it during that struggle? Why would someone who supposedly used a stun device in the bedroom to ensure silent compliance then get into a physical confrontation? The logical sequence would be: use the device to subdue, use it again if resistance occurs, maintain control through the threat or reality of repeated application. But that's not what the evidence pattern suggests happened. What we see instead is evidence consistent with struggle, with things escalating beyond control. Not the pattern we would expect if someone had an effective incapacitation tool they were willing and able to use. Let's think about this from a psychological perspective. If someone truly believed a stun weapon was necessary to control a 45-pound child, a child who, by virtue of her age and size, could be physically overpowered by any adult without requiring additional tools, what does that tell us about their mindset and planning? It suggests either extreme paranoia about the child's potential to resist, or a profound overestimation of what would be required to control her. But here's what's revealing. If someone had that level of concern about control, if they thought they needed a device to ensure compliance, they would use it consistently throughout their interaction with her. Yet, the pattern of evidence doesn't support consistent use of such a device. It supports a relatively peaceful bedroom departure, followed by confrontation that occurred elsewhere, under different circumstances, without the intervention of any device that could have prevented escalation. From an anthropological standpoint, we need to understand that tools of control, weapons, restraints, devices meant to incapacitate, appear in scenarios that have particular characteristics. They appear when the person using them needs to bridge a gap in power or capability, when they're concerned about their ability to maintain control through simple physical dominance, when they're planning for resistance and preparing means to overcome it. But they also appear consistently throughout the interaction, not just at the beginning. If you believe you need a stun weapon to control a small child in her bedroom, you would certainly believe you need it during any subsequent struggle or resistance. The fact that the evidence pattern doesn't support consistent use of such a device, peaceful bedroom departure but struggle elsewhere, suggests that either no such device was used at all, or if something created marks that were interpreted as coming from such a device, those marks were created under very different circumstances than the theory suggests. Let's shift to the philosophical implications of why this theory persists despite the logical problems it creates. From a psychological perspective, the stun weapon theory serves a narrative function. It helps explain how someone unknown could have gained control of her without waking the household, without creating noise or disturbance that would have alerted others. It fills a gap in plausibility. But when we examine it closely, when we follow it through the actual sequence of events and compare it against the physical evidence, it creates more problems than it solves. The undisturbed bedroom suggests no struggle occurred there, which means if a device was used, it was used so effectively that she never resisted at all. Yet later, evidence suggests significant struggle occurred somewhere. We can't have it both ways. Either she was compliant throughout, which would make a stun device unnecessary, or she resisted at some point, which should have prompted use of the device if it was available and the person was willing to use it. The theory requires us to believe in selective use of a control tool, used when it wasn't strictly necessary, not used when it would have prevented escalation. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about what repeated stun device use would do to a small body, and what evidence that would leave. Each application creates intense muscle contraction, potential tissue damage at contact points, certainly would cause significant distress and pain. Multiple applications over an extended period, which would be necessary if this was the method of control throughout the sequence of events, would create cumulative trauma that would be evident in examination. The documented evidence doesn't support this pattern of repeated electrical current application. What we see instead is evidence consistent with a single confrontation that escalated, not a sustained period of electronic control followed by sudden loss of that control. The absence of evidence for repeated device use, combined with the presence of evidence for significant struggle, suggests that whatever method of control was being attempted, it wasn't electronic incapacitation. So, when we consider the stun weapon theory in light of the undisturbed bed and the pattern of evidence that follows, what we see is a theory that strains under logical examination. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the theory requires us to accept a series of improbable elements, that a device could be used in the bedroom without creating bedding disturbance, that it could ensure compliance during removal from the room, but somehow wasn't available or wasn't used during later struggle. That marks interpreted as coming from such a device were created in a context and manner that doesn't align with how such devices actually function. The simpler explanation, the one that aligns with the undisturbed bed, with the peaceful departure from that room, with the evidence of struggle occurring later under different circumstances, is that no stun weapon was involved at all. She left that bed peacefully because she left with someone she trusted, or because she was so deeply asleep she never woke during removal, or because she departed of her own volition for her own reasons. The bedroom was not a scene of forcible control. It was the last place she slept before whatever occurred next unfolded in some other space, under circumstances that had nothing to do with electronic weapons and everything to do with a confrontation that escalated beyond anyone's ability to control it. Theme 3. The geography of struggle. Understanding where resistance began. We've established that the bedroom showed no signs of struggle and that the stun weapon theory collapses under logical examination. Now we need to confront what the undisturbed bed tells us about the larger timeline, specifically about where and when resistance or struggle actually began. From a forensic perspective, if the bedroom was not a scene of confrontation, if she left that space peacefully, then whatever terrible events unfolded that night occurred elsewhere in the house. And this geographic distinction between where she was last peaceful and where struggle occurred tells us something crucial about the sequence of events and about who could have been involved in both phases of that sequence. Let's think about what peaceful departure from the bedroom requires. From a psychological standpoint, a child in the middle of the night is at their most vulnerable and most trusting. If she left that bed without struggle, she left either unconscious in someone's arms or willingly with someone she trusted. Both scenarios narrow the field of who could have accomplished this peaceful removal. An unknown person entering a child's bedroom in the middle of the night typically creates fear response, defensive reaction, attempts to call out for parents. The absence of these responses, the absence of struggle evident in undisturbed bedding, suggests the person who removed her from that room or was present when she left it was not perceived by her as a threat. From an anthropological perspective, children's threat assessment operates on simple principles. Family is safe. Strangers are potentially dangerous. The peaceful departure suggests she was operating on the safe assessment, which dramatically constrains who could have been present during this phase. Now let's consider what we know about where struggle did occur. The evidence suggests that at some point there was significant confrontation. Circumstances escalated. Things went terribly wrong. From a criminological perspective, when we map the geography of a crime, we're looking for the sequence of spaces where different phases occurred. The bedroom appears to be the departure point where she left peacefully. Some other space, likely the basement based on where she was ultimately found, appears to be where confrontation occurred, and potentially there was movement through intermediate spaces. Perhaps the kitchen area where the pineapple evidence was found, suggesting she was awake and moving through the house at some point. This geographic sequence, peaceful bedroom departure, movement through house, basement confrontation tells us about a timeline that unfolded over space and time, not a single event in a single location. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask ourselves, what would cause a situation to transition from peaceful to confrontational? What changes between the bedroom where she left quietly and the basement where struggle occurred? One possibility is that she woke more fully during the intermediate period, became aware of circumstances that frightened her, began to resist or attempt to call out. Another possibility is that whoever was with her during the peaceful phase lost control of the situation, that their own state of mind changed from one of control to panic or desperation. A third possibility is that the confrontation in the basement involved different people or different circumstances than the bedroom departure, that we're not looking at a single continuous sequence with the same actors throughout, but rather phases that involved different levels of awareness, different people present, different power dynamics at play. Let's shift to the psychological implications of this geographic separation between peaceful departure and struggle. If we accept that she left the bedroom peacefully, and if we accept that struggle occurred later in a different space, then someone, whether the same person throughout or different people in different phases, moved from a state of sufficient control to enable peaceful bedroom departure to a state where they lost control and confrontation escalated. From a physiological standpoint, this kind of transition often reflects changes in consciousness, in emotional state, in the ability to maintain composure under stress. Someone who could manage the bedroom departure with enough care to not create disturbance might have been operating in a relatively controlled state. But by the time of the basement confrontation, that control had shattered. Whether through her increased resistance, through panic, through the realization of what was happening, and desperate attempts to manage it, something changed. And that change is written in the geography of the house, in the transition from undisturbed bedroom to troubled basement. From an anthropological lens, we can think about how domestic spaces carry different meanings and trigger different psychological states. Bedrooms are intimate spaces, spaces of vulnerability and trust. Kitchens are communal spaces, spaces of nurture and daily routine. Basements are often liminal spaces, less integrated into daily family life, sometimes used for storage or utilities, sometimes for recreation. The progression from bedroom to basement might reflect not just physical movement, but psychological movement, from intimate family interaction to something that needed to occur in a space more separated from the family's core living areas. If someone was processing impossible circumstances, making terrible decisions about what to do, they might unconsciously seek the more separated, less emotionally fraught spaces of the house to do what they felt they had to do. From a logical standpoint, the geography of this case, undisturbed bedroom, evidence of movement through the house, basement as the location where terrible things occurred, creates a sequence that constrains our possible explanations. We need to account for how she left the bedroom peacefully, why she was moving through the house. The pineapple suggests she was awake at some point, engaging in normal activity. What caused the transition from normalcy to confrontation, and why that confrontation occurred in the basement rather than elsewhere? Any complete explanation of what happened that night needs to make sense of this spatial sequence. needs to explain how each phase flowed into the next, needs to account for why the geography unfolded, as it did, rather than in some other pattern. So when we consider the geography of struggle, where it didn't occur and where it did, we're looking at a map of consciousness and control throughout that night. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the undisturbed bedroom tells us that whatever nightmare unfolded, it didn't begin with force or fear in that space. It began with trust or sleep or normalcy, with circumstances that allowed for peaceful departure from the last place she truly rested. What happened after she left that room, as she moved through the house, as circumstances led to the basement and to confrontation? That's where the terrible turning point occurred. That's where someone's control failed, or their desperation peaked, or their panic overwhelmed whatever careful management they had been attempting. The bedroom preserves evidence of before. The basement preserves evidence of after. And the undisturbed bed whispers that the transition between these states occurred somewhere else, in some other space, under circumstances that transformed a peaceful removal into a struggle that no one could control, and that ultimately could not be survived. We've walked through that bedroom, examined what the undisturbed bed tells us about how she left that space, traced the logical collapse of theories that can't account for both the peaceful departure and the later struggle. What emerges is a timeline that unfolds through space, a bedroom where nothing terrible occurred, intermediate spaces where she moved and perhaps even ate, and a basement where everything fell apart. The undisturbed bed isn't just evidence of what didn't happen in that room. It's evidence of consciousness and control at the beginning of the sequence, of someone who could manage a peaceful removal, of circumstances that would allow a vulnerable child to leave her bed without resistance. And when we contrast that peaceful beginning with what we know came after, we see the arc of deterioration, the progression from control to crisis, the terrible geography of a night when everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Next time, we'll continue following these threads, tracing the movement from space to space, always asking what each location tells us about consciousness and choice, about who could navigate that geography and why events unfolded as they did across the architecture of that house.